Do you have a fear of unknown things? How much price does Mike, a USA soldier, pay for his unknown fears? Let's jump into the video to know the story of Mike. Today I'm going to discuss a psychological thriller war film. Before this, please subscribe to my channel and hit the like button. The film starts with a hardened U.S. Marine, Mike, saying goodbye to a young lady at the airport and flying to his next assignment in a chopper. Mike and his spotter Tommy are set up on a bluff overlooking a desert in the following scene, waiting for their target to arrive. Tommy is a chatterbox by nature, while Mike is more serious. They see a large number of people on foot on one side and a large number of armed vehicles on the other side approaching Mike's target as a 65-year-old terrorist, Said Asif. Tommy and the radio announcer attempt to persuade Mike to make the hit. He realizes the gathering is for a wedding and the target might be the groom's father. When the husband and bride block the objective, things get much more difficult. Mike is instructed to kill the groom in order to get to the target, but he can't bring himself to kill an innocent person. In this confusion, Mike lost the target. He tells his command center. Armed persons guarding the ceremony see the couple and come to their aid. Gunfire pursues the objective as it escapes, while Mike and Tommy are forced to flee as armed men pursue them. They break their GPS while fleeing and take shelter behind a rock formation. When the armed men begin to approach the rock, Mike immediately produces a brilliant diversion that sends them in the other way. After dodging the armed guys, the couple requests an evacuation but are told they must cross the desert in front of them to reach a town 5 hours distant where they will be picked up. They went off on foot, facing sandstorms and sweltering temperatures. Tommy amuses Mike with tales about his kid back home. When Tommy notices Mike is quiet and seems to be bothered by something, he pushes Mike to open up. Mike confesses that he is having difficulty proposing marriage to his girlfriend Jenny. Tommy mocks him for his fear, but he also advises him that marriages may be tough at first, but that with time, you get the hang of it. As they go across the desert, the wind blows a warning sign their way. Mike takes the research seriously, remembering that over the past 40 years, 33 million landmines have been buried in the desert. Tommy tells him that it is just a Berber technique to keep attackers away. Mike is still walking carefully, his attention fixed on the warning sign. Tommy goes backward freely a few yards in front of Mike, making humorous jokes at Mike for being an overthinker when suddenly a click sound is heard, followed by an explosion. Tommy had unintentionally stepped on a landmine. Mike takes a step towards Tommy as he becomes temporarily deaf, and there's another click where his foot has just landed. In shock, he freezes. The roar of the explosion begins to fade. Tommy survived the explosion, but both of his legs below the knees were destroyed. Tommy screams and trembles in pain, while Mike, unable to move, tries to calm him down. When nothing seems to be working, Mike mentions Tommy's kid, which motivates him, and he is able to inject himself with the morphine that Marines keep in their front pockets. Tommy then attempts to grab for his radio, but the pain overwhelms him once again. When Mike notices his buddy in pain, he volunteers to remove his foot off the landmine in order to assist Tommy. Mike speculates that the landmine he walked on may have been old and defunct. Tommy tells him not to, and to persuade Mike, he takes out his pistol and points it at his head. He shoots himself after telling Mike that he must live no matter what. Mike cries hopelessly in agony. He is stuck in the desert, unable to move. He eventually gets weary of standing and goes down on one knee. Mike realizes he has to get the radio that's lying next to Tommy a few yards distant. To draw the radio bag towards himself, he hooks his shoelace to an axe. He soon discovers, however, that the radio's battery is dead and the spare is on Tommy's body. Mike is disappointed, but he comes up with another idea. He invents an improvised solar-powered charging system for the radio. Mike is now able to communicate with his bosses. He demands an urgent evacuation, but is informed that due to regular sandstorms, rescue helicopters cannot fly to his position. If all goes as planned, a convoy will arrive in approximately 52 hours to rescue him. Mike becomes irritated at the answer. The major then recommends that Mike try digging a ditch and leaping in it, which would result in just a non-life-threatening limb loss. Mike chooses to stick it out and wait for rescue while keeping an eye on the account. Then a huge sandstorm struck with full force. He can wait it out without shifting from his position. When it's done, the first thing he notices is that the storm has dragged Tommy's body and therefore the extra battery right next to him. However, the radio has gotten too far away from him. After a few hours, Mike runs out of water and becomes more desperate, even contemplating suicide. He then spots a Berber. He sees the Berber approaching him in a zigzag pattern. Mike attempts to tell him about the landmine, but the Berber mimics his actions as if mocking him. Mike attempts to describe his experience to the Berber guy, but he demands that Mike move on. He then disappears into the desert with Mike's water flask. Mike, very exhausted and desperate, begins to swallow his urine. When he sees a little Berber girl approaching him, he returns his water flask. She gives it to Mike, much to his relief. It's full of water, even though the female never talks. Using her toy troops, she, too, seems to advise Mike that he has to get out of his head and go on. Mike informs her that he is unable to move and requests that the young girl bring him his radio, but the child is unable to comprehend. Mike, in his desperation, becomes overly loud, frightening the girl away. Soon it will be night, and the temperature will begin to decrease. Mike starts a fire to stay warm. He begins to hear the sounds of wild creatures. To keep himself entertained, he pulls out his phone and looks at photos of his girlfriend. He also discovers a video from his girlfriend. Jenny informs Mike in the video that she is waiting for him. Mike has to win the battle and return to her as quickly as possible. Mike's emotions begin to surface. He's scared he'll never see his sweetheart again. He was fed up with everything that was happening to him. He begins to nod off, but he awakens to find that the fire has gone out. He finds himself in the midst of a swarm of wild creatures. He attempts but fails to frighten them with his pistol. Tommy's body is being dragged away by the animals, and one of them is approaching him. Mike, though, kills the beast with his pistol while using his torchlight. When the animal lands on a landmine, it explodes and scares the other animals away. The next morning, the same Berber guy appears and informs Mike that he is very fortunate to have lived so far, even after stumbling on a landmine and spending the night with wild animals in the desert. He again recommends that Mike move forward, but Mike refuses. Mike informs him that since he travels in a routine, he presumably knows where the mines are. The Berber replies that he has no idea where the landmines are and that he simply goes in a zigzag because it is safer than going straight. The Mike then asks him to get his radio. The Berber guy eventually accepts and returns the radio to Mike before continuing on his journey. Mike looks at his watch and sees that it's still 24 hours before assistance arrives. He gradually begins to have hallucinations. Mike witnesses Tommy's re-waking from his death. Mike is motivated by the imaginary Tommy, who assures him that he will survive this struggle. As the sun sets again, Mike begins to reflect on all of the errors he has made in his life. He begins to regret leaving his fiancée Jenny alone, and when he arrives at the mission, he is once again surrounded by animals. Mike begins firing at them randomly in the dark, but the animals still assault him. As he battles off the wild beasts, he becomes lost in his thoughts. As the light comes up, Mike returns to reality. All of the wild creatures that had assaulted him were dead all around him. Despite the fact that he was surrounded, he managed to kill all of the creatures. Mike has been sitting in the desert by himself for the past 4 to 5 hours, his foot resting on his thoughts. He then gets a message from his superior informing him that the rescue squad is running late. The senior wonders whether he can hold out for another 17 hours. He's already beyond his breaking point. Mike responds that he is unable to go any farther. The major informs him that someone wants to speak with him. Then Jenny's voice comes in, Mike. Mike rushes to apologize to her for abandoning her, for messing everything up, and for ruining everything he touches. He suddenly begins hallucinating and sees Jenny seated on a sofa in the desert in front of him. He attempts to approach her, but begins to tire. When Berber appears out of nowhere and catches him, he starts to fall. The guy begins to bandage Mike's wounds and tells him about the time he, too, walked on a mine and lost his leg. He informs Mike that losing his leg was like losing everything in his life. The pain of losing his legs, though, was wiped away when he met his wife and had a daughter. He believes that no matter what occurs in our lives, we must keep going forward. Mike informs the guy that he is indeed fortunate because his daughter, who gave him water, is stunning and has her father's smile. Mike is informed by the guy that he no longer has a daughter. She was killed in a mine explosion while on one of their father-daughter trips to dig up mines and replace them with tin cans. Mike's lessons are puzzled. The Berber informs him that although he is pleased that his daughter came to see Mike, he must now go on. Then he walks away. Mike sees his daughter for the second time. She, however, soon goes away with the breeze. Mike begins to hallucinate once again. He sees his violent father, who abused his mother. He sees his terminally sick mother while watching helplessly. He also remembers the wonderful moments he had with his lover. At that time, he hears over the radio that a rescue squad is approaching and that he must provide his precise position. He lends his flare, but before he can put it to use, the terrorists from earlier begin firing at him from across the hill. The gunshot causes a nearby mental explosion, which sends the flare flying out of Mike's grasp. He attempts to respond, but he is too weak, so he recalls his lover and uses that as inspiration. Mike then fires his pistol at the ground, triggering mine explosions that produce sand fog, concealing him from the attackers. He then takes his sniper weapon and dispatches the attackers. The flare is still out of reach when the rescue squad passes by. Mike recalls the Berber man's advice to keep pushing forward. He takes a step forward and takes a leap of faith. There is no action. There isn't an explosion. He discovers that the mine he walked on was really a tin can, most likely put there by the Berber's daughter while she was alive. As a result, the villager's words come true. Throughout this period, the villager assured him that he could go on with his life and return to his fiancée. He reminded him that he could accomplish it and that the only thing keeping in his way was fear. Mike is grateful to be alive, despite the fact that he had non-lethal gunshot wounds during the confrontation. He suddenly bursts into tears. Perhaps he felt relieved knowing that he will be rescued. Or maybe he was irritated because he had failed to see the gravity of the situation. He then fires the flare before collapsing on the ground. He is found by the rescue crew and returned home. At the airport on the way back home, Jenny is crying joyful tears as she waits for him. Even before embracing her, he gets down on one knee, as he has done throughout his life. He then proposes to her, vowing that he would never leave her alone again. So, the viewers, what is the key message from this film? In my opinion, the survival of human beings lies in the eagerness of moving ahead. Share your opinion in the comment section below. So, the viewers, this is all we have today. Please subscribe to my channel to encourage us for more videos.